Yeah, somebody just gave me this helmet. It's an ODST helmet, which I normally wear, but I thought I need to have it off so you can see my emotions, because otherwise there's no way to emote with a helmet on, as you know. See, that wasn't snarky, right? That was just it's just true. Wow, this is great.
Yeah, this is a lot of people.
Well, Corey and I just met, so this will be this. I have no idea what this is going to be, but thank you for all being here. I thank you for coming. And I'm Marty. This is Corey.
Hi.
Corey's the theorist, and I'm the composer.
I think that's right. I think I would call you a composer.
But I do know some theory, but we'll see how this works out.
Yeah.
All right, are we ready?
Oh, yeah, we good to go? Okay, cool. Hey, checking if this is, I don't know if this is helpful, but cool. All right, hi.
Take it away.
Yeah, I guess welcome to Preaching to the Choir. We're going to be talking about Halo. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that series, but yeah, my name is Corey. Just by way of brief introduction, I'm a music theorist. I am mostly known for writing, animating, voicing, producing the YouTube series 12 Tone, where I do a lot of things, but mostly break down and analyze music. And I assume most of you are not here to see me, so I'm going to pass over to my co-panelist.
Well, I'm glad to see your face, because I looked at some of your stuff and I thought, well, he's just sort of a disembodied hand that draws doodles and does things real fast. So it's good to see you. So I'm curious about what's going to happen. So I think we're going to do like a deep dive into Halo, the original Halo theme. So let me just say, I'll start, because some of you maybe have heard this story before, but I'll just go ahead and tell it to the room. In 1999, I was working with Bungie Studios, and it was before I actually had joined them full time. I was a freelancer, and we got this opportunity. We'd been working on this game, which was originally called Monkey Nuts, but Jason Jones didn't want to tell his mom that it was called Monkey Nuts, so we changed it to Blam. So we were working on this game called Blam, which eventually, of course, became Halo. We had this opportunity to show Halo to the world at Macworld in 1999, and Steve Jobs was going to introduce it to the world. And we got this gig like on a Thursday, and it was happening that next Wednesday, I think. So on Friday, I talked to the guys, and Joe Staten, who's the writer, said, we're going to do the scripted demo. It'll be an in-game demo, but it's for the Mac, and at that point, we'd only been working on PC, so there was no sound engine for the PC, for the Mac, and all we had was sound effects on the PC, so I could have had something with the Warthog sound and Rocket Launcher and Banshee and some other things, but because it was on the Mac, we had nothing, so it's like, what are we going to do? And I said, let me write a score for this demo. And there was no way to play it back out of the engine, so it was going to be I would record it, mix it, put it on a CD, have somebody, when Jason Jones went up and hit the space bar, which triggered the in-game scripted demo. So it was in engine and all the visuals. But somebody else would just watch him and hit play on the CD. So it couldn't be super in sync. It just needed to be whatever the sync was that happened that day. That's the sync forever, right? Because that's what got recorded. But what I said was, look, I think we should really, pull out all the stops, which meant I wanted to do an orchestral thing. I wanted to hire an orchestra and do a big thing. So I thought singers and an orchestra would be effective. And I knew the lights would come down in the room, and it would come up on the big screen, and then we'd have big speakers, and it could be a pretty powerful thing. Now, when I say hire an orchestra, that meant that I hired 6 string players, so 4 violins and 2 cellos, And then my partner Mike and I, who sang on jingles, we hired 3 other guys who we had probably just done Mr. Clean with. So we had done Mr. Clean jingles and other jingles. And so these guys came in to sing with me for the monk part, the Gregorian chant, which we'll see. Maybe you'll get into that. It'll be interesting. Yeah. So on the way to the studio, I was in the car and I'm like, okay, Joe had said we want the audience to feel a feeling of ancient, epic, and mysterious. And I thought, okay, ancient, well, Gregorian chant, that's ancient. So I thought it's got to be hooky because it might last, people might remember it for a couple months. No, seriously, I mean, at the time it was, I'm not saying that it was a throwaway thing. I mean, I wanted it to have some legs, but, I would have never anticipated what was going to happen with that series or that music. But so I was in the car and I'm like, we'll get to your part.
Yeah,
I promise.
I'm having a great time.
I was in the car and I'm like, okay, I need to come up with a hooky melody. What's one of my favorite hooky melodies? Hook meaning, like a hook, like a jingle, like a thing that sticks in your head. And it's like, yesterday, da 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 da. So I'm like, okay, Dorian, da 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 da. I'm not sure if I did that right, but anyway, I was thinking Dorian, and like, yesterday, da 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 da. All my troubles seem so far away, da 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 da. Okay, so it's not a cheat. Done. 4 phrases, 1 high point, 1 low point, Dorian, which is Gregorian chant mode, one of the Gregorian chant modes. And I thought, okay, that'll work, so that's what I thought. So that's where that melody came from. So I owe a little bit to Paul McCartney, who I ended up getting to meet and work with for Destiny, more than 10 years later. So I never told him that story, though. I could have. I think he would have been okay with it. Actually, I do. But anyway, that's how that came about. All right, so here we go. And by the way, it's Dorian. I hope maybe we'll talk about this a little bit, but yeah. It's just a scale. It's just a way to order notes and intervals, yeah. And it's Dorian, and starting on E.
Yeah, it's a kind of fancy minor scale.
Exactly.
But yeah, that was great. A little concerning because you already answered 5 of the questions I was going to ask. But yeah, I did want to sort of dig a bit deeper into, before we get into the specific song. Halo music is known for a lot of things. But in my mind, at least, first and foremost, it's known for orchestration, as that was sort of a big watershed moment in sort of the symphonic video game score thing. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about sort of your thoughts on both why you wanted to do it that way and also how you were approaching that when you were writing these pieces.
Yeah, well, like I said, it was ancient, yeah. Epic, mysterious. So the epic part, I thought, well, if we sound like a big thing, if we sound big, and an epic orchestra, there's no better way to sound epic than with an epic orchestra. Of course, in this case, it's 6 strings, but we cheated a little bit. We had some samples and some cool percussion. But yeah, I thought that it was, video game music was starting to really mature, being that, not that, Koji Kondo and Nobuo Uematsu and a gazillion other people, but those are friends of mine. I've met them. I love their music. But in the beginning, when video game music became a thing, especially in the 80s and 90s, most of the time it was platform dependent. So it could only do so much from a fidelity standpoint. 8-bit, as you guys know, because 8-bit music is a thing. But that's all you could do. So I was never really attracted to working in that space. I admired people who could get so much out of so little. It's still mind-boggling to me today, especially hearing people do sort of modern interpretations of that old music, and you hear how much content is actually in there, even with just 2 voices sometimes. It's just amazing. But anyway, by the time I was doing things, we could at least start using we could record stuff. We could record voice actors. We could record, real sound effects, and we could record real music. But there wasn't a lot of budget, so a lot of it was samples and MIDI and things like that. So I thought, by 1999, it's like, come on, let's be like a film score. Let's get live players, because when it comes to orchestra, there's nothing better than live orchestra with live players. I mean, samples are amazing, but they can only go so far. So that's really the reason. I thought the most epic thing, especially because I'm a big cello fan, I wanted the cellos to be chugging away and being epic.
I mean, who isn't a big cello fan?
Yeah, I guess. Yes.
But yeah, I guess moving in a little bit to the specific song we're going to be talking about, which is the Halo 1 theme. I figure probably one of the most iconic pieces of video game music ever written, I would say. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Got a second on that. But yeah,
Okay.
that's another one. I'll give you that one. But I think like when I'm starting to analyze a piece of music, before I get into like all of the like technical theory stuff and like what is this chord, what is there like a melodic motif, blah blah blah, what any of that, I always like to start with the question of vibe and like what is the emotion of the piece, what is the narrative of the piece, and you're already hitting on some of that with like the epic, ancient. What was the third one? Mysterious. That was it. But yeah, I wanted to sort of nail down a bit what we're thinking, what we're getting from this vibe-wise and sort of emotionally, especially because I think in video game music, this is particularly important because, as a standalone song on an album, you have a lot of space to be ambiguous with your emotions and let people interpret it different ways. But when you're part of a larger work, like a video game, like a movie, something like that, you wind up needing to be a bit more specific on that point, because if someone interprets it differently from your intention, that can mess up their entire experience of the whole game. And so you're setting, especially something like an opening theme, you are setting the tone for everything. And so I think it's...
And what's interesting, not to interrupt, to me, what's interesting is at that moment, it was a specific piece for a specific show. It was a marketing piece. It was something to introduce the world to this, hopefully, universe that we were going to be creating. I didn't even know at that point if it would end up being the Halo theme. It was, at the time, it was the 3-minute piece that would go up for Macworld. That's all it was. So it wasn't like I'm setting the tone for the future. Trust me, if I'd had more time to think about the responsibility of this piece, I probably would just, crumbled, because it's much easier just to go, okay, I got to do this thing for this day, and that's all it is. And then it turns into something else, which is great.
Do the next step over and over, and then suddenly you've walked all the way to writing the Halo theme.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think, beyond like the epic, ancient, mysterious stuff, I was wondering if there were sort of any other things that as you were writing it, or even just looking back, that you really think were important in that vibe, in the emotion of that piece.
So I'm going to talk again slightly on the technical side of what the assignment was.
Yeah.
So I knew what the story in general, there was going to be this guy who had green armor on, and we'd been playing with this world for a while, and the cool thing was the Warthog, which you could drive. But we were still thinking maybe third person, and we were not thinking Master Chief was a character. He was just he was just a Marine, a super soldier, cybernetically enhanced future soldier. I think we called him Future Soldier for a while, which is hilarious. But he was just going to be, he wasn't an individual character. You weren't going to play as him. You might be controlling third person, several squads. We didn't really know how it was going to be. But Joe decided we'll follow this one guy who goes into this thing and turns on a machine or whatever, and then aliens see him, and then he runs out. And the cool thing was he was going to run out into the world with no loading screens. It was like a seamless environment switch, which at the time was pretty unusual. It was really cool that we could create this entire world, interiors, exteriors, driving, flying. It doesn't seem all that unusual now, but in 1999, that was pretty cool. So Joe told me what it was going to be and what the general pacing of the thing was going to be, which is very important to storytelling with music. You have to have some sort of understanding of the pacing. And of course, you need to have understanding of the time it takes. And so I said, Joe, how long is this going to be? And he goes, it'll be probably 2 or 3 minutes. And I'm like, okay, that's 2 or 3. Like, I can't write something that's 2 or 3. It's like, I'm going to end up with something that's going to be a length. And he goes, yeah, we haven't worked it out yet, so we don't know. So I'm writing this thing, going to Mike's studio on a Saturday. Joe is back at Bungie Studios trying to make this, and he and the other guys were trying to script this thing. It's like, okay, it's going to be 2 or 3 minutes. I better write a piece that's 3 minutes long, but I'll put some smushiness on the beginning and the end. Smushy, it's a musical term.
It's a technical music theory
Yes,
term.
exactly.
We learned that one in college.
So that if it gets shorter, I can just squeeze it in, and if it's as long as I have, I can squeeze it out. So there isn't like necessarily a steady tempo from beginning to end. There's some there's some play on the two ends. And I was, of course, I was hoping it would be the longer version. I hope it would be 3, and it was about 3, so that was good. But that's why so it's interesting. I'm not sure if I would have had that structure just if we'd known exactly what the picture was going to be, and if I was working directly to picture where I would be in sync with it. I needed to have some just like give and take, some smushiness, and like, okay, the cymbal swells there and something cool happened on the screen at the same time. I intended that.
I mean,
but that doesn't say much about the vibe. So I would say certainly the ancient, the Gregorian chant is the smushy part. That sets a tone. I like then going ahead and just staying in that mode. But then I knew the epic stuff would have to have some pace and some rhythm and because my name is O'Donnell, it probably ended up being more Irish jiggy than I thought it should be.
I did pick up on a little.
But I swear I hadn't listened to Riverdance yet. I hadn't. So it's just part of my DNA, I think.
But yeah, one word that I'd like to throw at you in terms of vibe that I was picking out, that I don't know if maybe this is unique to me or if this is anyone else here's experience as well, but listening to it, it sounds profoundly lonely to me. I don't know if is that just me? Does anyone else hear that? Okay, a couple people do. And not like in a sad, mopey sort of way, but almost in like an Ozymandias sort of way, like look on my works ye mighty, and which also ties into that like that ancient, that like mysterious, that all of that. But it really, I think, especially when you were talking about so that move from like controlling a squad to controlling this one guy, and this being just his journey through that. Yeah, I think that is an aspect that really stands out for me in terms of how this piece relates to what the game is doing. Yeah, well, if you think about at the time, we were not thinking about a main character, but by focusing on the one super soldier, or future Schultz soldier, but even we follow him into the sort of cool alien thing, and then the aliens chase him out, and then he gets in a warthog with some other dudes. Yeah. So there were other people there, but you couldn't help but say, "That's me. That's the hero. That must be who I am." And so it wasn't really on purpose. I think it just turned out right. Yeah, that's one of the great things about art. And if I can get up on a little bit of my art theory soapbox for a second, but like, it's just a lot of meaning is emergent, and that doesn't mean it's not there, and that doesn't mean it's not important, and that doesn't mean that like it doesn't make the whole thing better. And so again, apparently this is not something that everyone hears in this piece of music, but it's definitely for me, and for at least I think like 3 or 4 people raised their hands, but like I'll take it. It makes it adds meaning and adds depth, and so I thought that was really cool. Cool. But yeah, I think probably at this point I'm gonna try and start playing the actual piece of music we've been talking about. Hopefully this works. We did do a little sound test. Thank you. I often applaud my computer as well. Thank you. But yeah, so in case anyone doesn't know what we've been talking about, it's the one that sounds like this. But yeah, so I think the obvious place to start here is, of course, the choice to use chanting. And you already talked a little bit about where that came from a technical perspective, and how that tied into some of the ancient and the epic questions. But I guess, what am I trying to say? I think it's, oops, sorry. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the overall texture of that with those really low. Is that those were cellos?
There was some low. There was a low synth drone with some low strings that I think I had low strings playing that too. Yeah, they came in at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, just sort of I want to talk about that, the emptiness that creates, having that like really low pad. And especially with that rubato timing, where there's not really like you're saying, it's not like a clear beat, clear time signature. I mean, there's time signature, but you know what I mean. But there's not like a clear pulse.
Yeah, and it was when we did it, I conducted it with the people, so I was like, oh. So there's no click, 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 click. And that was on purpose because Gregorian chant is known to be, the monks in a cathedral with lots of reverb, and there's not necessarily a strict meter or tempo for what happens. So that it's just automatically has rubato, which just means give and take, and it's just a little more fluid, which is another sort of unusual thing for game music at the time. A lot of game music is, and still to this day, is very metrically ordered. So I thought that'd be interesting.
Yeah, and I want to dwell on it for a little bit, because I tend to think, like, the introduction to the song, the first section, the first thing you hear, kind of serves as instructions for how to listen to the rest of it. And so as you get into a lot of the rest of it, where it is metered and there's a lot more happening orchestrally and it's a much bigger score, you're sort of carrying through that implied emptiness from the beginning, even though you've obviously left this sort of Gregorian chant section behind when you bring in those drums. But I guess I was curious sort of your thoughts on how that sort of sets the stage for what's coming next.
Yeah, well, I think that it was intended to get people's attention and to make them go, okay, this is not the normal thing we're used to. Like, I just thought this would be a really good way to grab people's attention and say, we should listen to this because we don't know where it's going to go. But it sounds, sounds old.
It does sound old.
Old, and of course there's religious overtones to it. Obviously, it's church music, right? And so people associate it with, there's something mystical, there's something sacred. Who knows what this story is? It's got to be deeper than just bang bang pew pew, right? Yeah.
And that religious aspect is also emphasized by the fact that it's in a game called Halo.
True. That's exactly right.
But yeah, I guess since you already talked about the Dorian aspect of it and a lot of that, we can just move on to the next.
Sure.
Because
Hello, Tech Ops. I'm here to reduce volume.
Oh. Sure.
Oh, okay.
Do you want me to play it again, or?
Microphone volume.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So.
Who's soft?
Where's the label, these?
Hello.
Hey.
That's me.
Hey. Testing. Hopefully I'm one of those.
I hope so.
Yeah, that would be.
That would be a problem.
I don't know how I'm so loud if I'm not, but.
All right, let's do this the hard way. Oh my God.
Just discovered something.
Okay, so you are one.
Okay, cool. Hey, 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 hey.
Are we blowing people's ears out yet?
No, I don't think so.
I don't know, how are people's ears? Good? Good?
It's all
Alright.
good. Heard feedback that time.
Working on that.
All right. Oh, that's definitely some feedback. I can try and just be closer to the mic if that helps.
Yeah.
I think that, okay, yeah, I might have been like doing this a bit, and I can try and maybe move that so I can do both.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
But yeah, cool. People in the back. Is this good? Are we good?
Good?
All right, cool.
Good.
All right, cool. Yeah, no, good. Let's listen to some drums. All right, gonna stop it there before we get into. I want to talk about the drums. We'll get to the strings, I promise. Here. Happy? But yeah, so there's two things I want to talk about with these drums.
Yeah.
And first, before we get into the rhythm, just sort of again, I want to talk about register because I'm fascinated with register. But like you have these really low synths and these low strings going, and then you add these really low drums as well, and there's sort of nothing in that upper register space in terms of the orchestration.
Right.
And I have a lot of thoughts on what that does to the mix. I'm curious if you want to talk about it.
No, I don't think it was. I mean, I just thought it would be cool.
That is a lot of my thoughts as well. But yeah, I think that especially coming from where you have that, like, it's not like a super high Gregorian chant, but it's something in sort of that middle register. And then you have those strings that come in that are again sort of in not super high, but sort of mid. And having that space that's just low and deep does, I think, again, thinking about stuff that happens early as instructions for how to listen to what happens later, it sets that epic I'm going to use the word tableau. It's not the word I'm looking for. I don't have time to find the word I'm looking for. But it sets the stage for that epic interpretation of what comes next. And it also, it sounds cool, to use a very specific theoretical term. But yeah, I guess on the rhythm then, because you're doing, I think, a really interesting thing with the rhythm here. It's sort of reminiscent of like a Humiola type thing where, I mean, the classic example is like America from West Side Story, where like da 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 da. But you're doing that in like sort of alternating between 6/8 and 3/4. But you're
Yeah. I mean, it might be my Irish roots, but I've always liked that.
Yeah.
That's one of the go-to rhythms, which is compound meter. So
Yeah.
it's instead of duple, meaning splitting the beat into two, you split it into three, and that's really your only choice. It's an amazing thing. You basically, when it comes to rhythms, you really have only the choice of doing 2/8 or 3/8.
Yeah.
So it's like I love the 1, 2, 3, 4. You have it's rock and roll, dong, dong, right? You got the backbeat, but you can go digga da digga da digga da digga da digga da digga da instead of da 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 da. But that also gives you the option of every once in a while putting a sort of a duple overlay.
Yeah, and that just so people
So you could
know
you
what
could
we're
have
talking
2 and
about.
3s
Yeah.
happening.
Let me
Yeah.
just see if I can.
Yeah. Stopping it
We'll
there
get
again.
to the strings.
We got to fill out the hour, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a 3-minute piece of music. Give us time. But yeah, I find it really interesting because again, if you look at that sort of West Side Story example, like they feel very even, like the ba ba it's hard to say like which is the dominant one. But by doing like 3 bars of that 6/8 thing, especially with that like 6/8 gallop thing you're doing, like right, like it really makes that feel like the meter, like what's happening, and then you have this 3/8 that feels much more cross-rhythmic or almost polyrhythmic, to use a term that makes me sound smart. But like I said, I think it makes it a lot harder to sort of feel that 3/4 as 3/4 rather than as something that is happening over a 6/8 beat.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. To me, it was just like, it's essentially, I think the first time I wrote it down, I think the first music that the players played was just 4/4 with triplets. Yeah. So it was all just triplet, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, and so that's what they played that. And then in future iterations of it, I think I just did it in 12/8, but you still conduct it in 4.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, all right. Now let's play the strings. Is it cool if I stop there? Are people going to get mad at me again? But yeah, just to talk about that first string line first before we get into all of the other things. One thing that really stands out to me is that that melodic structure of that initial thing is very simple. Like it's a walk. If you just listen to those high notes, because there's the lower parts too. Those feel more like, I mean, coming from a metal background, I would call them chugs. I don't know what they would be called in a symphonic
This
context,
makes a great metal piece. If you've heard any people do metal renditions, I love it. So it's basically, has that feel.
It is basically a metal piece written for orchestra, which is part of why I like it. but yeah, if you look at sort of that rising line, it's just 1 2 3 4 in E minor,
right?
And yet it sounds really powerful and really impactful and really interesting. And I think there's a tendency with a lot of these things to expect great melodies to be complicated melodies. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you chose to approach this with something so not straightforward isn't fair, because it's a great melody, but something so simple.
Yeah. So how many people are familiar with the term Leitmotif? Leitmotif? Okay. Oh, wow. A bunch of music people in here. Ooh. Okay. Now I'm scared. So when I was in college, I did a paper on Berlioz, who invented the term, and he did.
I'm going to turn my Wi-Fi off. I'm sorry.
He did the Symphonie Fantastique. So everybody know this one? Okay, so it's got this leitmotif in it that represents his love that he was enamored with. Anyway, it's a long, ridiculous romantic story from the Romantic era. But the melody he wrote was long and complex, and you had to listen to it. And then when he would bring it back, he had to bring it all every time he brought it in, because it was going to be in all the movements. It just sort of like, in my opinion, and I love the symphony, it's wonderful, but like it just, there it is again. Like you can't, it's not easy to develop with it because it's too complex in and of itself. And then he did another piece later on using the same technique called Harold in Italy. And then he sort of, I feel like he learned this lesson, that he needed to do something that was just a hook, that just was easy, simple, short, and then he could do so much more with it. And that was just that was something I had learned, and of course doing commercials for years, I knew that, you know, the effective melody is a melody that gets into your head and stays there. And if it's long and complex, it's much harder for that to happen. So I was always looking for basically, okay, this is going to be the bass line, and it's going to be sticky. So that's why. Yeah,
and it comes back in a lot of other places. So I think that was a great call. And the other thing I wanted to mention, and I don't know that I have that much to say about this, but I'm just going to throw it out there because I notice it and I can't not point out things I notice, is that like in this you do have again that 6/8 rhythm, but it doesn't join the percussion on that 3/4 bar.
Right.
It still keeps that sort of compound meter thing going. And so again, you get that sort of the implied polyrhythm in the percussion part becomes this sort of explicit polyrhythm once the strings come in. And you get that sort of metric complexity, metric displacement almost, where it doesn't quite line up. And that, I think, adds a lot to that epic feel you're going for, where you have this, again, you have this complexity that isn't necessarily obvious on the surface, but becomes much easier to pick out when you're listening to all of the things together. But I think that's all I have on.
Let me just say one other thing, just another sort of thing that I knew to get the drive, to get the aggressiveness, to make you feel the feeling of epic and aggression and drive and thrust, right? Oh, the thing that I loved about the cellos, and the reason I wrote it this way is, ba, 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 bum, it's an octave. So it's just an octave jump, but it's like, you know, it's not stepwise, even though the melody is da 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 da, right? Da 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 da. So it's just a stepwise melody, but it always goes back to that lower octave. So by the time it's doing an octave and octave and a fourth. They're ba 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 ba. They're down da ba ba da da. And I knew that I wanted to hear the rosin. I wanted to hear this. I wanted to hear maybe some open strings got in the way. I mean, I want to hear I want it to sound aggressive, and it's not necessarily the perfect string writing in terms of how you might be trained sometimes. And unfortunately, when some people redid that music, they split it. They split the cellos. Da da da. Da da da, and the first cellos will go da 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 da, and I could hear that. I hear that, and I was like, no, that's wimpy. There's nobody's working. Yeah. That's too simple. You gotta be grabbing those low notes, and you gotta be jumping up, and that's the only way you get the aggression. So. Yeah. I know you might not think this way, but sometimes it's really fun to work with live musicians because you can see them sweat, right? It's like you want them to work.
Yeah, I mean, this is, like, I've been reading recently a lot of, like, scholarship on punk music. And, I wouldn't call this a punk song, but you see, I might. But you see a lot of that same sort of thing in the way that you have to think about punk music not as a series of notes and sounds, but as a series of motions on a physical instrument, and how that impacts both what you can do and what happens when you do it. And so that makes a lot of sense that is playing such a huge role in this, because it does sound sloppy in a good way a little bit. It doesn't sound like it would sound if you programmed like a MIDI cello, no matter how good your sample library was. And so you get, again, that physicality of it that is so much of, especially aggressive styles of music, you want a much more embodied sound than you want in something that is like, you know, a Berlioz symphony or something. So, again, not punk music, but has some similarities in that. But I guess if we can move on to the next string line that comes in. That is not where that starts. Let me rewind a little bit. And who knows what happens after that. But again, to the leitmotif point you were talking about earlier, that line also starts with that same walk from E up to A, and then it just keeps going. Like, it goes up like an octave and a half or so, but it sort of has that same, I mean, at least the main melody of it has that same initial structure that is building off of that.
Yeah, and the low cello melody is simply minor, right? It's not Dorian until I bring in the upper strings. So I wanted to get back to the Dorian so people know this is Dorian. It's not minor. It's Dorian. So that's why the C sharp ends up happening in the upper strings.
And that was something I wanted to ask about, because obviously, like you said, Dorian is a very common Gregorian chant mode. Mm-hmm. It's less common in this sort of music. Like, I would have expected, if I had just heard this segment without any of the previous context, I definitely would have expected to see natural there. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of why it was important to sort of carry that Dorian thing through.
Sometimes a very simple reason. It's like, I'm tired of major and minor. I like sometimes being ambiguous. I love open fifths. I love ninths because they have their own feeling, somewhat more lonely sometimes. But they don't say this is sad, this is happy. Yeah. And triadic music for the most part. Major's happy, minor's sad, and that's it. Major, minor, major, minor, major, minor. Add sevenths, add ninths, whatever. But they always have the third in there. I went off on a tangent. Sorry, but like, I really enjoy writing and sticking to a scale that gives you just a little bit different. Some of the chords that come out of that scale are not traditional. They're slightly. I shouldn't say not traditional. Obviously, Dorian is an ancient mode, so there's tons of music written in Dorian. It's just
not common.
It's not common today.
Yeah,
for the most part.
Yeah, and this was like we mentioned earlier. Dorian is sort of a fancy minor scale. To provide a little more context on that for anyone who doesn't know, Dorian is the minor scale, but instead of a flat six, like in E minor, that would be C. It has a raised sixth, like a major sixth. So that, to me, when I listen to Dorian, what it does is it removes a lot of the darkness of natural minor, and I think it provides, like you're saying, a little more sort of emotional ambiguity and a little more depth to it than I would expect from just a straight up minor piece. So that was a lot of what I was reading into that. Was it feels, especially because, like you say, in that initial string section with the cello melody, there is no C sharp. There's no indication that we are still in Dorian. Mm-hmm. And so that does sort of feel like that dark minor, and then you go through, and it takes a little while for the cello to get to that C, or not the cello, the strings violins, to get to that C sharp. And so you have that slow build back into like, oh no, we're still there. Mm-hmm. Like that's still what's happening. That's still the emotional space in a way that, just if you'd gotten there and it had been a C natural, it would have been like, oh, okay.
Well, and I would also say that, like, because I have, an affinity for rock and roll also, along with classical music, one of the things that rock and roll does is most rock and roll is basically mixolydian, which means there's nothing better than the lowered seventh. And we don't want to do leading tones because that sounds like, grandpa's music, right? So what's fun about Dorian is you have you're in a minor key, but you have a major subdominant. And you have a minor dominant, so you don't have the leading tone. So some people make the mistake of like, well, I'm going to put a leading tone in there because it's 5/1 is what we need. And it's like, no, the root movement is important, 5/1, but you want to stay in that Dorian feel, so it's a lowered seventh. And when I say lowered seventh, it's only compared to a major key, the boring major, scale. So it's just more fun to me, and in rock and roll especially, is da da. It's like da. It's not da da. It's da da. Right, and so, in rock and roll, you parallel fifths is great, right? You want parallel fifths. That's chunky, right? But in classical music, chords. You sort of like you avoid parallel fifths. You always resolve the leading tone a certain way, which gives it its classical feel. It's what makes it sound like common practice tonality. So I wanted to do an orchestra that didn't necessarily sound like common practice tonality. That's all. And
a lot of that with the leading tone is that sense of finality that it creates. Mm-hmm. And when you lower it and when you do that flat seven or minor seventh, it still feels like you're going back to one if you go from that to the root, but it doesn't feel like there's not like this big like air horn being like we're at the one chord now. Like that's not as much, and so it's able to continue moving in a way that like if you have this big like 4-5-1 in major, or even like 4-5 to 1 minor with a major 5 chord, you have this really strong landing that is sort of hard to move on from very quickly, which is something that is good in a lot of classical music where you have this very long directional progression. But in something like rock, it's not as desirable to really have a moment where you're like, okay, we're stopped, we're going to wait for a second, now we're moving on. That's much less often the goal. So I think that's a lot of where that comes from in rock. But yeah, like, let's see, where is this starting? Stop it there. But yeah, we have. I'm glad you mentioned the Irish jig part of it, because to me that really does feel like what's happening in that rhythmically, and with those large leaps, but especially that compound 6/8, like bum ba da ba bum ba da da dum, like that is a very classic thing for that, and also partly because of the relationship between traditional Irish music and traditional like Western sailing music. It has a very sea shanty feel to me as well, and feels very nautical, which, you know, for like metaphorically at least, is sort of what's going on with the story as well. It's space instead of the ocean, but
Right. Well, it's the UNSC.
Yeah.
Which is the United Nations Space, what is it? Command? Yeah. And they're Marines, so
Yeah.
part of the Navy. And
Yeah.
Master Chief, by the way, is the highest non-enlisted role that you can reach.
Yeah. So that was
Not
definitely
non-enlisted. What am I thinking?
yeah.
Non-commissioned. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I wasn't thinking about that, by the way. That's just, I like the thought that, like, yeah, it's got sort of a nautical thing. It's ships in space. Okay, cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think that aspect of it is probably, I don't know, feels self-evident enough to me that we don't have to super dive into where that's coming from. Although I do want to talk a little bit about those vocals as well.
The vocals, okay.
Because I think it's a really interesting contrast with the choir at the beginning.
Yeah.
Where it feels more like less Gregorian, I would say. Feels more like wailing, not like the nautical thing, but like WAIL. But I'm curious, sort of the choice to sort of bring back vocals in that way.
Yeah, that is I don't know why I decided, but I thought, it would be fun and sort of makes it more mysterious. I thought it would make it sort of mysterious and alien. It's like, okay, so there's Gregorian chant monks, and then there's sort of this Arabic kind of wailing that can happen, right? Which I love. And so one of the guys that I hired, who was a singer, I said, "Can you do that kind of, just chanting thing?" And he goes, "Yeah, I can do something like that." And so we got to this part. It was actually the last thing we recorded. And so because we recorded the guys singing the monk chant and the choral stuff that happens later on. That was all the last stuff we did. And so then I talked to Bob, who was there, and I said, "Okay, I don't know, but right in this little section here, I want this sort of kind of cool wailing sound." And he goes, "Well, what do you mean?" And so we started playing, and I'm like, "Yeah, I started singing that. and he goes, "Yeah, why don't you just do it?" And I'm like, no, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just making up nonsense. And he goes, "Well, that's all I would be doing." And I'm like, oh my gosh. So that's me.
Oh.
And and I was embarrassed. I did it, and all the other guys were like, "Yeah, that sounds cool," and the engineer's like, "Oh, it sounds cool." So I'm like, "Oh man, I don't know." So we mix it. That's why it's sort of mixed kind of in the background.
Yeah.
It does not. I mixed it that way because I was like, "Oh, come on, oh really?" And believe it or not, we did 2 mixes that day. I did one with no crazy chant, crazy wailing, and one with it, and I took it to Bungie, and Joe and Jason were there, and they were about to get on a plane to New York, and I said, well, here's the 2 versions, and I played it for them we tested it out to see, it was working pretty good. It's in sync with the thing Joe had come up with. And then I said, but here's the version without the wailing, and they started playing it, and then Jason's like, oh, I love that other one. Forget that. And I'm like, really? Are you sure? Because it's kind of bizarre. But, it stuck. It's one of those things that, once again, it's an unexpected thing. It's just not something you hear a lot. And so it's like all those little elements of, like, sort of tickles the ears in ways that people aren't expecting is, I think, successful. So there you go.
Yeah, definitely an unexpected thing, but definitely feels natural once it comes in. Like, it feels right that it happens. And I think part of that is the mixing too. Like you said, you mixed it in the back because you were a little embarrassed about it. But I also think
that was the right place for it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. When you mix something super far in the back, it also makes it feel very far away.
Mm-hmm. Wow, 10 minutes left. That's amazing.
Yeah, we have been very slow. I promise I will play a little bit more music. But yeah, it feels very far away and distant, and it has that sort of depth. Again, I keep using the word depth, but again, coming back to that sort of epic and ancient, it feels, I don't know, there's something about like echoey, far away voices that feels ancient to me. Like, it feels like you're in these very large, like, archaeological spaces. And so I think, like you said, that was absolutely the right place to put it. I think if you had mixed it really far forward, it would have dominated a lot of the other things that were going on instead of being the supporting part that it needed to be. But we only have 10 minutes left, so I am going to play the next thing.
Great. There's your hemiola.
Yeah, we need to talk about harmony.
Oh, okay, cool.
We'll talk about the rhythm too, but that is G minor there?
Oh, yeah. I can't remember. Sounds like it. I think you're right.
But yeah, we've been in not just E minor, but E Dorian, and then suddenly we get what I would, from a rock background, call a rhythm stop, and just like everything drops out except for this melody, and it's playing G minor for some reason. And so I was and then it goes, I believe, A minor, but I was wondering if you could talk about sort of why such a weird chord.
I don't know.
Okay, fair.
First of all, but I know that we were. I think you can get into a habit of doing pedal tone music, and pedal tone always sounds great. Like, you could be over a pedal and just never leave it, and then that, to me, starts to get boring. So I knew I had to get off the E, even though it's like, this is E, pedal tone E, droning all the time, and I had to move off of it. So that's why I went to there.
And it makes I think it's really interesting, again, with the Dorian thing, because E minor and G minor, they're not like super related keys, but they have this sort of I'm going to say relative parallel relationship, and then not bother explaining what that means because we have 8 minutes left. But they have this sort of tonal relationship. But because we weren't actually in E minor, a lot of that, feels even more complicated just because there were those couple C sharps in there. And so it feels like and not in a bad way. I think it's a really interesting and cool choice, but it feels very jarring to me to sort of bring out this G minor, whereas, if it was G major, that would make a lot of sense to me. Like, that would be like, okay, cool, that's the 3 chord in E Dorian, but by putting in that B flat, it becomes much more, and the F natural as well, it becomes much more striking. And then it sort of moves up to that A minor, which is again is a chord in E minor, not in E Dorian still, but it sort of starts to move back a little bit through that like stepwise motion, and then able to go back into that pedal thing. But yeah, I guess we also definitely want to hit on the rhythm, because at this point you've definitely very much aggressively switched to much more of a 3/4 over that 6/8 thing for a little bit. And just for like these 4 bars, so like what was the thought process with that?
It's just another one of those things where, like, when you're improvising, especially, if you're improvising in a compound meter, this one of the things you'll end up doing. Da 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 da. Like it's fun, and I wanted the strings to, that figure da 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 da. It was a cool figure, and I just liked it.
Yeah. And honestly, that's what I love about talking to composers, is 'cause so much of my work I'll like go through and find like these small things and like spin like, oh, this is how this impacts, this is all of these things that this does, and then I talk to the composer and they're like, it sounded good. I thought it was fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess, we have 6 minutes left. I'm gonna hit play and we're gonna listen to a little bit more Halo music. I don't know what it was doing there, but yeah, back to that same thing. But yeah, I guess if we want to talk about some of those, because that's what sort of had some of that, again, that nautical string melody, but with also that big cello melody underneath it, and so blending those together in a way that, I don't know if you want to, like, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
But the only thing I want to talk about, especially in the cello part, which I like counterpoint, and I use counterpoint techniques, which is, it's not melody and bass line. It's all your voices need to be interesting. And one of the ways you do that is that if you see things moving in parallel, you go, okay, well then, if the notes and chords are moving always in parallel, then the top one is the important thing, and the bottom one is just going along for the ride. So when I find little things like da 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 da, so I could do that in parallel fourths, right? But that's too expected. So I looked at the parallel fourths and I went da 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 da. Let's see, da da da. The inner voice goes down a step to a C sharp, so it goes like this, and then the next one, this one goes up, this one goes down. And then when this comes down, this one goes up, and it does both oblique, which is staying in one spot while the other one moves. It also does contrary motion. And what I did that simply because I thought it'd be more interesting to hear. And then I'm like, oh, that makes cool chords. Like, it wasn't, I didn't start with, I want these chords. I was like, I just want to change the motion to be contrary motion. And then that's where the lower stuff comes. So it has this contrary motion thing, which ends up being, that ends up being its own motive that I used in other pieces later on. If you think about, if anybody knows Halo 2, you know that there's a bunch of that happening in Halo 2. That's directly from that, and it becomes its own thing. Yeah. And then the upper line is just, because I'm a piano player, I love da 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 da. I love always going back to my thumb, and I love doing that to string players, because string players are like da 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 da. They would just play that part. But if they have to go da 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 da, they have to. Then once again, I'm making them sweat a little bit. It sounds cooler, and because they'll get sloppy if you just give them a line. Then the duration of the notes will start to run into each other. But if you always put that interruptive, they have to jump down to the lower note. It just sounds more fun to me. So
yeah, I mean, you hit on something there that I can't believe I forgot to mention, which is sort of the diminution of the original theme, where like when you bring in the cellos, it's like da 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 da. It's like it's 2 bars per note, basically.
Yeah,
and then partway through, you sort of get rid of that held bar in the middle, and it becomes this much more it's the same structure, again, sort of developing the motif, but it becomes much more energetic because you don't have those spaces
Right.
in between, and it becomes like constant. It is 2:58. I don't know how much time we have left for anything, so might want to start wrapping up, but there is another minute or so of this piece of music. It is also very good. We could just end the panel by playing it. Yeah, that's okay. All right, no analysis. Here's the rest of the Halo theme.